July 17, 2007. Congonhas Airport, Sao Paulo, Brazil. One of the busiest airports in South America. A flight touches down at Congonhas Airport and doesn't stop. It races past the end of the runway, crosses a major highway at full speed, and slams into a warehouse and fuel station. Seconds later, the city skyline is lit by fire. When the smoke clears, 199 people are dead, everyone on board, and 12 more on the ground. This is the story of TAM Airlines Flight 3054, the deadliest aviation disaster in Brazilian and South American history. To understand why Flight 3054 didn't stop on the runway, we have to look at what was happening in Brazil at the time. The country was in the middle of a serious aviation crisis. Years of underfunding had left airports and equipment waiting for upgrades that never came. Air traffic control was also under pressure. There were not enough staff, and labor disputes made delays even worse. Passenger traffic, meanwhile, kept growing year after year, pushing terminals and runways far beyond what they were designed to handle. And instead of fixing problems before they became dangerous, regulators were often reacting after problems had already surfaced, delaying critical safety improvements. At Congonhas Airport, being the busiest airport in Brazil, that pressure was always there. Staying on schedule became a silent goal. Crews felt it. One delay could affect many other flights. That constant pressure followed the crews into the cockpit. It added to their stress and influenced their decisions. Congonhas itself was never an easy airport. It sits in the heart of Sao Paulo, boxed in by dense neighborhoods and high-rise buildings. Pilots often compared it to landing on an aircraft carrier: short runways, narrow margins, no room for error. The main runway, 35L, was just under 2,000 meters long, short compared to international standards for busy jet airports. And on the day of the accident, rain was falling. The runway had recently been resurfaced, but it was missing a critical safety feature: transverse grooves. Those grooves are designed to drain water away and prevent a thin, invisible film from forming between tires and asphalt. Without them, a wet runway becomes slick, dangerously slick. Several pilots had already reported poor braking earlier that day. By the time Flight 3054 arrived, the runway was already in a dangerous condition. It was so slippery and risky that the plane could easily lose control. In aviation, there is a dangerous threshold known as hydroplaning. It happens when a thin layer of water builds up faster than a tire can push it away. The pressure of that water lifts the tire off the pavement just enough to break contact. At that moment, braking friction disappears. Steering control fades. And an aircraft weighing tens of tons begins to slide like it's on ice. Engineers can even predict when this starts to happen. There's a formula based on tire pressure that estimates the speed at which a rolling tire will begin to ride on water instead of asphalt. At Congonhas, that threshold was lower than it should have been. The runway had been recently repaved, but it lacked the surface textures that help channel water away. No microtexture. No deep grooves to drain the rain. Add to that a slight runway slope and an overworked drainage system, and water began to pool on the surface. Earlier, in 2007, a judge had tried to restrict larger aircraft from using Congonhas because of these exact risks. But the decision didn't last. Under pressure from Brazil's aviation authority, the restrictions were overturned and operations continued. Flight 3054 was an Airbus A320, a modern twin-engine jet. But there was one critical detail in its configuration. The thrust reverser on the right engine was deactivated. This wasn't illegal. Under aviation rules, an aircraft is allowed to fly with one reverser inoperative as long as specific procedures are followed. On paper, it was acceptable. On a wet, short, ungrooved runway, it quietly removed one more layer of safety. On paper, the airplane was legal to fly. Flight 3054 was operating under minimum equipment list. It's a rulebook that defines what can be inoperative and under what conditions without grounding the aircraft. The thrust reverser on the right engine was not available. It had been deactivated. The left engine's reverser, however, was working normally. The ground spoilers were also available, but only if the aircraft's computer logic allowed them to deploy. They would not come up on their own. And the auto brake system was ready as well, but it depends on those spoilers deploying first. Individually, none of this sounded alarming. But together, it changed the logic of the landing rollout. The Airbus, a 320, is a fly-by-wire aircraft. The pilots don't move the control surfaces directly. They make inputs and computers interpret those inputs, deciding what the airplane will actually do. In a system like this, everything depends on doing things in the right order. When the right engine's reverser is deactivated, that engine must stay at idle. Only the left reverser can be used. That single limitation quietly reshapes how spoilers deploy, how auto brakes engage, and how the airplane slows down. Under normal conditions, this configuration does not jeopardize landings, but it does narrow the margins. And it increases the consequences of even a small deviation from the expected sequence. Earlier that evening, at 5:19 p.m. local time, TAM Flight 3054 had departed Porto Alegre. On board, 181 passengers and 6 crew. Among them were 19 TAM employees and several people who had narrowly missed this flight due to last-minute schedule changes, including members of the Gremio Football Club. In the cockpit were 2 captains, a pairing TAM sometimes used because of a shortage of experienced first officers. Both highly experienced. Both with thousands of flight hours. As they prepared for the approach into Sao Paulo, the cockpit voice recorder captured a small, human detail. Captain DiSacco mentioned he had a headache. It seemed minor, but later, investigators would examine whether even slight discomfort could affect focus in a high workload phase of flight. As the aircraft descended toward Congonhas, the tower controller issued a blunt warning. The wind is north. The runway is wet and slippery. The crew acknowledged it. They continued with the landing checklist. And because the right engine's reverser was deactivated, they reviewed the plan one more time. Only the left reverser would be used. Everything else would have to work exactly as designed. At 18 hours, 48 minutes and 24 seconds, as the Airbus A320 crossed the runway threshold, a calm, familiar voice sounded in the cockpit. Retard. In Airbus aircraft, that word isn't a warning. It's a command. It tells the pilot to pull both thrust levers back to idle, disconnecting the auto throttle and letting the engine spool down for touchdown. The flight data tells us what happened next. Captain DiSacco pulled the left thrust lever back correctly, but the right lever stayed where it was, locked in the climb detent. Investigators believe the reason was tragically simple. Because the right engine's thrust reverser was deactivated, the captain may have thought that lever didn't need to be moved at all. A small misunderstanding, or a brief mental slip at the worst possible moment, under heavy workload, on a wet and slippery runway. In a conventional airplane, that mistake might have been survivable. In a fly-by-wire Airbus, it triggered a chain reaction. The aircraft's computers now saw 2 different commands, and they responded exactly as they were programmed to. First, the spoilers. On the A320, ground spoilers will only deploy if both thrust levers are at or near idle. Because the right lever was still in climb, the system refused to extend them. No spoilers meant the wings kept generating lift. The wheels stayed light. Braking effectiveness collapsed. Auto brakes only activate after the spoilers deploy. Since the spoilers never came up, the auto brakes never engaged. Then came the engines. When the left lever was pulled to idle, the auto throttle disconnected. The right engine, still commanded to climb by its lever position, did exactly what the computer believed it should do. It accelerated. Within seconds of touchdown, the airplane was in a nightmare configuration. The left engine was in full reverse thrust. The right engine was producing forward climb power, one side trying to stop, the other trying to take off. The result was violent asymmetric thrust. The aircraft veered hard to the left and barely slowed at all. From that moment on, there was no runway left that could save them. The airplane isn't responding the way it should. Inside the cockpit, the crew can feel it. The aircraft isn't slowing. The runway is disappearing beneath them. In the final seconds, Captain DeSacco tries to wrestle the aircraft back under control. The Airbus leaves the runway at nearly 90 knots. It crosses a busy avenue, clips a light pole, and plows into a 4-story TAM Express warehouse and a nearby fuel station. The explosion is immediate, fueled by thousands of liters of jet fuel and the flammable contents of the buildings. The fireball engulfs the site in seconds. There are no survivors. The impact site was a scene of overwhelming destruction. The aircraft's speed and mass were so great that it tore through much of the TAM Express building, reducing large sections of the structure to rubble. The fire that followed burned for hours, so intense that it slowed rescue efforts and made recovery painfully difficult. Everyone on board the aircraft was killed instantly. On the ground, 12 more people lost their lives, employees inside the building and people near the fuel station next door. The force of the impact and the heat of the fire left many victims unrecognizable. Identification became a long and exhausting process. In some cases, families waited nearly a month for confirmation through DNA testing before they could finally know. With 199 lives lost, the disaster became the deadliest aviation accident in Brazilian history. Brazil's Aeronautical Accidents Investigation and Prevention Center spent 2 years reconstructing what had happened. Their final report, released in September 2009, did not point to a single person to blame. The right thrust lever was left in climb instead of idle, triggering a chain of failures that blocked the spoilers, stopped the auto brakes, and left one engine pushing forward while the other tried to slow the aircraft. At the same time, the newly repaved, ungrooved, wet runway offered little grip, making loss of control inevitable when the plane failed to slow down. And finally, the airport's safety margins. There was no runway end safety area, no space designed to absorb an overrun. So when the aircraft failed to stop, there was nothing to slow it down before it reached buildings, traffic, and fuel tanks. Flight 3054 was not brought down by one mistake. It was brought down by a system that allowed small risks to line up into one irreversible chain. And in the end, this tragedy changed how the industry thinks about runways, training, and the way humans and machines share control in the cockpit. Because the lesson of Flight 3054 is simple and unforgiving.